Yesterday, we saw a joint press conference between Trump and Netanyahu regarding Palestine and Israel's war with Hamas. Now, we knew something to this effect was coming. Trump has been outspoken in his support of Israel so far. He made that claim that Hamas needs to have returned all of those hostages by the time he gets into power, or there would be hell to play. But prior to this, we really had no idea exactly what to expect, whether this would just be political support for Israel or more weapons and funding, or what it now appears would be real military support and maybe even an expansion of the United States' overseas territory. So what exactly was announced and what's just going on? Well, Hamas and Israel do currently have a ceasefire, but historically, let's be honest, these ceasefires have never really lasted, and they always result in another attack on Israel by Hamas and then Israeli retaliation, as we saw in 2023 in October, and a further escalation of the war. The Biden administration's position on the Israeli-Hamas war was officially supportive of Israel, but in reality, the Democrats have a large base of support from young people who are very staunchly in support of Palestine and Hamas and oppose Israel. So it was a very tough issue for Democrats. Trump came into his presidency seeking to make it clear that there is full American support for Israel and opposition towards Hamas. And so we knew some kind of press conference, executive orders, or something was going to come. We just didn't know what it was going to be. So what was the announcement? Well, Israel and the US are going to launch a mass resettlement program of Palestinians and a changed Palestinian state. The 2 million people living in Gaza or who used to live there will be relocated elsewhere, not entirely clear where at the moment. Trump did say Egypt and Jordan, but those countries have literally built wars and armed them with weapons and soldiers to stop Palestinians from emigrating to them over the last year, and they're firmly saying no to accepting any Palestinians. And Trump could also go another direction and push for some Arab states to take them in as well. Trump, though, thinks that he might be able to convince Egypt and Jordan in particular, or sway them into accepting them, maybe using tariffs or threats or whatever else it might be, just like we've seen with Colombia, Mexico, and Canada over the last week or so. Trump also said there would be an enlarged Israeli state, likely taking control of some of those areas, those enclaves that will have their civilians removed from, and in particular, those enclaves are almost certainly going to be controlled by Israel. And then Trump also said that Gaza could be run by the US. I would be personally incredibly surprised if he wanted to turn it into a state, but more likely some sort of overseas territory like Guam or Puerto Rico. And it's obviously not hard to recognize the similarity between that idea and the idea that Trump has proposed of taking back control of Panama. Now, journalists did ask under what authority the US could control Gaza, and Trump essentially said that he just sees it as a long-term ownership position, bringing stability to the region, a lot of jobs, and a lot of wealth as well. Now, we can't talk about this without establishing a very simple fact first, that Trump has in the past used the process of anchoring when negotiating to get the best deal he can. Essentially, he starts his negotiating position off with something incredibly hard and difficult for the opposing party to accept, something that frankly they never even considered before, but he gets that reality set into their mind so that they're more open to accepting terms or a deal that beforehand they would have considered unacceptable. There's a very good chance that Trump is doing this when he calls Canada the 51st state of America, or when he says he wants to buy Greenland from Denmark, and with his stated aim of taking back control of Panama as well. This could just be a negotiation tactic to try and scare the Arab world into thinking this is going to happen so that they're more accepting of terms that Trump is actually seeking when it comes to negotiating. I obviously can't say that this is the case, only that Trump and his close circle are the only ones who really know what their actual aims are, but this is a distinct possibility. Now, at the end of the day, what this really feels like is the US abandoning the two-state solution for Israel and Palestine, which has been their official policy for decades, but it's existed as an idea and been negotiated around since the 1930s. But frankly, this area has been ravaged by war almost constantly for the last 100 years. The two-state solution is not being actively worked towards or negotiated around as of today, and really it's just a way for foreign powers to refuse to take an active side. If your government states that they support a two-state solution, it really just means they don't want to get involved and they're happy to leave things as they are, because it's clear as all hell the two-state solution isn't solving anything. What's been the response from the rest of the world then, and what should we expect going forward? Well, obviously all the Arab states are very, very unhappy. Jordan and Egypt were called out as countries that should take in those Palestinians that get evacuated or relocated, but they've been refusing to do this for years already. They don't want them, and they really don't like this proposal. Saudi Arabia almost came out instantly stating that they will never negotiate or recognize the existence of Israel if there is no Palestinian state. Again, this isn't too surprising. Saudi Arabia historically has had no relations with Israel, or very, very poor ones, but over the last few years things had started to get a bit better, with relations normalizing a little bit, right up until October 2023 with Hamas's attack on Israel and the reactionary offensive offensive by Israel into Gaza. Basically, Saudi Arabia said they will not support this, but they don't have any stated red lines to not cross or outline any active actions they will take to prevent it. Their military, after all, is almost entirely dependent on exports from the West, and it's notoriously poorly trained and ineffective. Military action against the US from Saudi Arabia or other Arab states is simply never going to happen. Now, Hamas has, and a bunch of other terrorist groups have obviously come out and said this is unacceptable, they won't allow it to happen, and these ones will actually use active military force to try and prevent it, albeit they've already been using military force against Israel for years, and they're terrorists, so that is expected. France came out and reiterated their support for the two-state solution and said they oppose this and that it would be destabilizing to the region with an influx of refugees. Spain, Ireland, and a bunch of other European nations have all basically said the same thing. Iran, Turkey, and Russia have all basically said the same thing too, reiterating their support for a two-state solution for what the UN proposed. The UK also said roughly the same thing as everyone else, but a little bit more diplomatically than most, because our government is simply terrified of finding themselves in the firing line of Trump at the moment, and most other countries already are in the firing line. Simply put, the US and Israel are the only countries that really want this. Everyone else just wants to go back to ignoring the problem. Trying something like this, it risks a mass destabilization of the area. If Hamas are expelled and not destroyed, they'll simply move into neighboring countries, and we might end up with another situation like we saw during the Arab Spring or the rise of ISIS, which was awful for the region, but spilled out heavily into other countries as well. And accepting refugees is basically a guaranteed reduction in the popularity of any government in the world right now, so the risk of millions of refugees spilling out into Europe or something is not exactly appetizing. It's sad to say, but Western governments are largely quite happy with the situation in Palestine right now. Sure, there are headlines on the news and there are civilians and soldiers dying, but it isn't reaching our countries, and our politicians like it that way. The two-state solution obviously isn't a solution, but it's an easy way to just ignore this whole problem and not get attacked by either side, so politically it's very desirable. Now, I can't state for sure that this is going to turn into another large war in the Middle East. The US boots on the ground are going to come and it's going to turn into invasion, and I'm not also saying that this is just a negotiating tactic by Trump or that it's a real plan that's going to happen. But American boots on the ground in the Middle East over the last 30 years has been profoundly unsuccessful as a policy, so much so that no one has dared to push for it over the last 10 years because of how bad it went. Afghanistan was an absolute failure. The democratic government was propped up while American and allied forces like the British, French, and Canadian were there, but once we all pulled out, it fell apart almost instantly, and now the Taliban is the government. Iraq saw that similar problem with Saddam pushed out, a power vacuum created, and ISIS, along with loads of other militant groups rising to power, expanding outside of just Iraq into Syria and a couple other places as well. And the cost of all this was thousands of dead American and other allied troops. It was politically a disaster, and almost no politician today supports the actions taken back then, and it seemed like intervention in the Middle East would be reserved to just small amounts of unconventional forces, special forces and the like, and a hell of a lot of airstrikes and drone strikes. We don't know the full details yet, but if American conventional forces are deployed, this is going to be very unpopular amongst literally billions of people. Now, Trump did mention in passing that the US might take over Gaza after the Palestinians have been resettled. Let's be honest, at this point, who knows what the plan is, but that would reduce the chance of conventional American forces getting caught in battle. Now, I do know that this is a finance channel and we frequently talk about geopolitics, and I often get people saying, I have no idea what I'm talking about when I mention anything to do with a war or conflict, but honestly, I studied military history at university, I got my degree in it, and I focused entirely on counterinsurgency warfare. To summarize 6 months of my life, my 15,000 word final dissertation for my degree was basically trying to understand why there were almost no successes when it comes to counterinsurgency in the modern age, especially comparing with other counterinsurgencies that we saw in the 50s and 60s, this specific one called the Malayan Emergency, which was a complete success. And at the end of the day, it all comes down to the growth of the media. Counterinsurgency warfare itself isn't actually difficult. It's difficult when you try and do it humanely, but you go back 2,000 years when Julius Caesar conquered Gaul, modern-day France, and there was a massive insurgency once the conventional armies were defeated. But Julius Caesar cleared the insurgency up and defeated that as well incredibly easily. How? Well, he killed 2 million people and he took another million into slavery. The entire point of insurgency warfare is to melt into the civilian population, to blur the lines between a combatant and a non-combatant. But you go back a few hundred years and that didn't work too well because the counterinsurgents would just target and kill everyone. With the growth of foreign news and media reporting on everything in the early 20th century, basically everything changed. The Boer Wars between the British and South African farmers wasn't any worse than the other thousands of conflicts that came before it, but it was reported on by the media, so the civilians at home suddenly saw what was happening for the first time in their lives and they were appalled, and the war became politically very difficult. The Vietnam War wasn't lost militarily because the Americans were too violent like most people think it was for the opposite reason, because they weren't aggressive enough. Again, go back to when counterinsurgency wars were actually won, and something that we see as an atrocity today, like the My Lai massacre, that wouldn't even be a footnote in a war 200 or 300 years ago. But then, of course, the media is the reason the US wasn't able to be violent enough. If it had been more violent, the resistance to the war in the States would have been even greater, so that would have led to a loss for different reasons, so there simply was no winning with the state of the media. Now, if American conventional forces get deployed to Gaza, and if this turns into a counterinsurgency, it is almost a guaranteed lose for America. US forces will have to decide between letting lots of their own servicemen and women die, or playing loose with rules of engagement and treating civilians badly and getting a ridiculous amount of bad press, and that will become politically untenable. The only real possibility of success here is the relocation of the civilian population peacefully. The most widely regarded successful counterinsurgency operation in the 20th century was called the Malayan Emergency, and I wrote about it a lot during my degree and throughout my dissertation. One of the reasons it was so successful was because of a policy called New Villages, which was a cleaned up, nice way of saying forced relocation into internment camps. Now, this wasn't a nice policy. It was cruel and would have been considered a gross violation of those civilian human rights if it happened today, but there wasn't much, if any, media coverage of it at the time. But the reason this policy was so successful is an insurgent force has to have a supporting civilian population to hide amongst and gather resources and intelligence from, or it can't succeed. And the policy of forced relocation removed that supporting population and crippled the insurgents. Now, it seems like that might be one of the aims here. Hopefully, the places the civilians are moved to aren't as cruel as New Villages were, because they were pretty awful, to be honest. But if the local population can be removed, and Hamas in Gaza is deprived of that population to hide behind and gather resources from, then this could be successful. And yes, Trump doesn't need to worry about another election, but Vance does, and almost every other Republican does as well. And what I'm trying to get across with this is that fighting a counterinsurgency war in this day and age is just awful across the board, and there's simply no way to come out on top. The media will always remain stacked against the security forces, and when we have democracies and public opinion actually matters, that's a game changer. I'm sad to say I'm really not sure what is going to happen with all this. I'm not going to pretend to know, but I do seriously hope conventional forces aren't deployed, because one thing is certain, it will get incredibly messy incredibly quickly. Now, if you haven't seen my channel in a while, check to see if you got unsubscribed at all. I am back and making content again consistently. And if you have information, knowledge, or expertise, and you're interested in the idea of building an online education company, check out the link down below in the description. I have a free guide showing you how you can turn 5 years of experience into a 100K a year online coaching business.